This non-oil and gas GDP in Russia in 2023 grew by 7.2%, whereas in 2024 it grew by almost 5%, namely 4.9%. In other words, we see a higher growth rate than across our GDP. Let me start with an overview of the current state of the Russian economy. Despite a challenging external environment, the Russian GDP over the last 2 years has been growing by more than 4% every year. In other words, that was higher than average across the world. Speaking about the structure of this growth, let me cite a specific criterion indicator which we have dubbed non-oil and gas GDP. It's calculated so as to factor out the influence of industries related to the extraction of hydrocarbons. So this non-oil and gas GDP in Russia in 2023 grew by 7.2%, whereas in 2024 it grew by almost 5%, namely 4.9%. In other words, we see a higher growth rate than across our GDP on average. In other words, the contribution of the commodity-related component into the economic dynamics of our country is no longer defining. Moreover, at the current point in time, it is showing negative dynamics. And by far, the defense industry is not the only thing sustaining the general growth of GDP, despite what some claim. Yes, indeed, the defense industry has played a role, but we have to look at the structure in detail. Over the last 2 years, we see growth in agriculture, industry in general, construction, logistics, services, finance, as well as IT. In other words, almost all key, systemically important industries of the Russian economy have been growing. What does it tell us? It tells us that thanks to the efforts of dozens of thousands of companies and enterprises, their teams, managers, thanks to the initiatives and efforts of millions of entrepreneurs, our economy is not simply growing steadily. Rather, it is also gaining in quality, complexity, as well as diversity. The idea of a Russian economy being completely commodity-based and dependent on the exports of hydrocarbons is evidently outdated. It's becoming a thing of the past. Reality tells us a different picture.